We are here as men of peace, but we are here also to declare our full and forthright support of what is in great measure a military alliance.
But in the background is a much wider and more suggestive question connected with the fact that Canada seems to have moved from a pre-national to a post-national phase of existence without ever having been a nation.
That bigness and complexity are functions not so much of numbers as of ideas.
We built a country, east and west and north. We built it on an infrastructure that deliberately resisted the continental pressure of the United States. For 120 years we've done it with one signature of a pen. You've reversed that, thrown us into the north-south influence of the United States.
Hello, and welcome to the 10th episode of the podcast of the Red Ensign. A bit of a different show for you today. Typically, this podcast is about history and Canadian politics more directly. Today, we're going to talk about a set of ideas that have profoundly influenced particularly modern Canadian society and particularly Canada's Laurentian Elite. And in order to do that, we're going to talk about the ideas of Karl Popper and the Open Society. And in order to do that, I've brought on an expert in philosophy, my friend Athenian Stranger.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this. Love talking with you about these things. This will be a lot of fun.
And for those who aren't familiar with your content, Athenian, I know you've got a website. I think it's athenscorner.com. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, Athens Corner. Also, I'm on Buzzsprout. Again, Athens Corner, and I'm slowly beginning something of a YouTube kind of format. I mean, you can find me there with some samples of the kind of things that I do on the Athens Corner website, and it's adjacent Buzzsprout linking. So.
And I know you're extremely active on Twitter with your audio content. So a lot of stuff on classics, some stuff on more modern philosophy. But when I realized how tightly integrated Popper's comments were with the classical tradition, I knew that I needed somebody who had that set of experience. So I broke my general rule and invited a non-Canadian on. So you're the first non-Canadian on the podcast. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, to drive home exactly how influential Popper and his conception of the Open Society has been on Canada's Laurentian Elite, I did some background research in preparation for this discussion, and I found a former candidate for Prime Minister of Canada, Michael Ignatieff, who has been a highly influential member of Canada's Laurentian Elite for a very long time. He's got a major theater on the University of Toronto campus named after him. He's a big donor and has been a very influential part of the kind of network of sense-making institutions from which the Liberal Party of Canada draws their policy. And here is Mr. Ignatieff in 2017 at Central European University.
Let's do a little work. I've got some slides. Here's very roughly the menu. Who were open societies' old enemies when the idea is created in 1945 in Karl Popper's work? What was his target? What are the new enemies of open society? That is, the new adversaries, the new opponents, worthy opponents, opponents to be taken with the greatest seriousness. And then the most difficult question of all for a community like ours, should we be rethinking the ideal? Has it outlived its usefulness?
So when we're looking at an idea that really permeates elite education in Canada and has a former prime ministerial candidate lecturing about it and lecturing about its relevance in current politics at a major university, I think that's a set of ideas we need to seriously understand in order to understand the kind of belief system that has dominated Canada's dominant elite faction. And so that's why we're going to take this on. The other kind of piece to this I got started looking at this problem because there's a very interesting set of articles, very interesting article in First Things called Return of the Strong Gods, written by R.R. Reno, where he argues that one of the defining challenges of the 20th century for the kind of conservative tradition in the Anglosphere has been the inability to assert positive values. And when you start to dig at why the conservative tradition in the Anglosphere struggled to assert positive values, you run into Popper over and over again in the thinkers who struggled to defend their institutions. And so I just think it's worth taking a few minutes to understand Popper, to understand his influence, and to understand the tension between Popper's contentions and some alternative thinking that might exist.
Sure.
So, Athenian, why don't you kind of start by giving us some context of who Popper was, why he was writing, when he was writing, why he was so influential?
Yeah. So to begin with, many people today, many of your listeners might think, why are they even talking about Popper? Because no one really, for the most part, no one really talks about Popper anymore. Because, on the one hand, there's this belief in progress that is pervaded even philosophy departments and things. And Popper was incredibly influential in the mid 20th century for a couple decades. And what ended up happening is that no one really talks about him anymore because he was so influential that there were so many critical responses to him that just eventually ended up winning the day. And then other ideas of these things just sort of began to take hold. Now, particularly with regard to political philosophy, and I can sort of explain that as well. The thing to know about Popper is he comes from the tradition that is generally known as the Vienna Circle. He was from Austria, and he was an immigrant to the UK. Now, what you had going on, there were a number of things that come out of the Vienna Circle, but primarily for Popper, at least, the two that he understands as the most influential, or at least that he's responding to with, and in the tradition of, are going to be what are known as positivism and historicism. Well, let me sort of add a third one there, idealism, which would be curious because when you were playing the clip by that former prime minister, I wasn't sure if he said if we need to re-examine the idea or the ideal, because that's going to make a difference, a little bit of a difference.
Ignatieff is not a philosopher. He's saying ideal in the political sense. So
okay.
In Canada, Popper's Open Society was translated from a philosophical set of ideas into a political program, which was designed to instantiate the Open Society as a real society.
Okay.
And so he's speaking as a politician who takes a set of ideas that he has a pretty, I listened to the lecture, he has a pretty, a workman level understanding of Popper's ideas.
Okay.
And he's busy translating it into justification for his political program.
Okay. So, so with Popper, effectively what you have is, positivism is the school of thought in philosophy. Now, we always have to be careful in the realm of isms, because there are always exceptions to the rule, right? There's like, well, does so-and-so really fit into that categorization or whatever? So these are in many ways, they're just sort of broad concepts to at least get us in the realm of understanding where these people are coming from or what they're addressing. Positivism was it was a response to a number of things that were happening at the time with German idealism and a kind of return of Kant. but it's the claim essentially that knowledge, true knowledge, the only kind of genuine knowledge, is knowledge that issues from modern science. That's it. And so we're talking about effectively the mathematical sciences and physics and things like that. It's like that is the truth. That's a reality of things. Now, that doesn't necessarily entail a kind of materialism, which is often associated with it, but that sort of can be the case. This is coming primarily from, in France, Comte, in England, the UK, John Stuart Mill. Now, that is effectively going to be Popper's position on things. However, we have to be very careful because the strict positivist is going to say that only scientific knowledge is genuine knowledge. Popper is more cautious. He says that's going to get us into the realm of the falsifiability of things. He's going to say that he's only concerned with things that can be falsified. And this is by way of a kind of scientific method. Now, that's going to be the weapon, we could say, that he's going to combat what he understands as the greatest problems, politically speaking, in the West. And those are going to come from two traditional schools of thought, one of them very new, one of them very old, historicism and idealism. Now, these are in many ways related, but the two figures, the two thinkers most emblematic of what those schools of thought are, at least for Popper, are going to be, on the one hand, Plato with the theory of the ideas, and then on the other hand, Hegel with what can only be. Hegel is the great influence for Karl Marx, and in Plato, what Popper is going to find is the great legacy of kind of communism and such in the old school, but also these various claims that you can't even test them, you can't even experiment on them. It's like if you're just going to assert that there's this kind of separate realm of existence, and that's going to be what we're going to use to guide us politically. I mean, these things have consequences if they're wrong. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I mean, this is very interesting. So he divides open society and its enemies into kind of two big chunks. One is dealing with what he calls the historicists. And I find it very interesting that after beginning open society with the discussion of the different types of historicism, so he opens up by saying, well, there's a kind of theistic tradition of historicism where you identify your group as the chosen people and they have a special mission from God. And that's the kind of, that's one kind of historicism. And then he identifies another kind of historicism, which is this kind of racialist historicism that suggests that on some kind of scientific basis, you have a material duty to advance the interest of your people in this way. And he comes out as a critic of both of these things, but he begins his criticism not with, so as a non-philosopher, if I was writing about either of those two types of historicism, it would not immediately spring to my mind that I would start with Plato. He does. Why do you think he does that?
Well, and this is where the issue of positivism and in historicism are going to be sort of at great friction, because that's going to provide the boundaries from which Popper understands his task, and one of those being Plato. Notice the title of the text, The Open Society. Now, Popper is fundamentally arguing on behalf of, in favor of, egalitarianism. Now, the issue with that is that Plato is going to be the one from whom we have the long tradition of what is the good, right? Uh, and what Popper wants to argue on behalf of, with respect to the open society, is he's wanting to talk about what he's saying is the good society, but he's not going to call it he's not going to call it the good society, because in order to do that, he's going to have to lay claim to these kinds of philosophical positions of well, values is what they've come to be called.
Yeah.
We can explain why that's a problem. But that ultimately right there, the wanting to say that it's the good society and not being able to do that, that's ultimately, I think, what's going on with the issue of Popper beginning with Plato, because again, it's going to be this ethereal realm of the good that somehow is to be the standard of what we as humans are to take as our lodestone going forward for ourselves in constructing our own societies.
Yeah, so for Popper, what unites the two types of historicism is this commitment to, what Plato might call a form of the good society.
Right. That's going to be, and that's what we get in the Republic, is the so-called best city in speech. He constructs the best city in speech, and it does in fact involve not simply communism. Radical communism, the complete dissolution of the family, all of these things. And so, what a typical reading, a reader of Plato's Republic, if they're sort of typical or something, is going to walk away from the text and think to themselves, wow, in order to have the best possible society, we've got to completely dissolve the nuclear family, or the family itself, at certain levels. We've got to have, it's got to be communism. And something about the best, or the perfectly just city seems to be radically tyrannical, in the sense that we no longer would think it was just. And it's sort of like, if that's what Plato thinks, then we definitely have to kick some of that. We got to kick that stone over, and that's what Popper is effectively doing with beginning with Plato.
That's interesting. So you pointed out here that in his framing of the open society as, I'm going to try to be careful with my words here, but he's trying to frame the open society as like a positive, a society for which people should strive, right?
That's going to be the one that he believes that the best kind of human flourishing is possible.
Right, but he's struggling to assert why that is, because if he asserts it as an ideal, he finds himself as a historicist all over again. Is that the basic trap he's dancing with?
Well, not of necessity is he going to end up in the realm of historicism, but he is wrestling with the idea of making judgments. Now, for the positivist, and particularly the school of positivism, if this is why science becomes problematic. Science can accomplish amazing things, but science itself cannot tell you if the things that it is doing are good or evil, right? I mean, the claim that many people say is that science is neutral. In other words, it's value neutral, or as it sometimes gets stated in other terms, there's the fact value distinction.
Yeah.
And so Popper wants to concern himself strictly with facts, and not necessarily have to make these value judgments on them, because value judgments become problematic because they're what are difficult to falsify. And that's going to be his novel introduction into the realm of philosophy, is that things can be falsified, because he's going against the entire tradition, for instance, of beginning with like Francis Bacon in the role of induction. He flatly says that Bacon's method of induction is a fiction, because it leads to an infinite regress. Now, the problem with an infinite regress is you never get to know one way or the other, is this really true? And so what Popper is going to say is, no, we can find out if things are true or not if they are amenable to being falsified, right? Because induction doesn't necessarily allow itself that kind of thing. Experimental philosophy or experimental science and stuff. What Popper is saying is he says people will simply have to, if you follow those typical methods of science, you're stuck saying, if someone says, well, why? All you can say is, I don't know. But if you can falsify it, you can say, and someone says, why? You can say, well, this is why, because it's false, right? Yeah. And that's going to be the beast of a task that Popper sets for himself and attempts to overcome with this text, the Open Society.
Okay, so there's two other notes that I think we should make before we move on with this discussion. First of all, we discussed Popper's historical context in the sort of philosophical tradition, the positivists that he's responding to in sort of the intellectual world and his intellectual peers at the time in the Vienna Circle. But I also think it's important to note the political context in which his work became very influential. So Popper becomes very influential in the immediate period after the Second World War. And his arguments are given tremendous currency because of the cataclysm that unfurled in both the First World War, the Great Depression, and the Second World War, that readers and popularizers of Popper succeed in attributing to the positivist idealism of the regimes in question, right? They make arguments that whether it was the Kaiser, whether it was the mid-century regime in Germany, whether it was the Imperial Japanese regime, whether it was some of the communist regimes at the time, all of these regimes were the antithesis of the Open Society, right? They fall under historicist societies or various versions of kind of positivist. They have various versions of positivist philosophy sitting behind them. And Popper's work becomes influential politically because it purports to offer an alternative to this. And I think it's probably a good time now to try to describe for our audience, if we could, what Popper thinks the Open Society is.
Well, that's effectively going to be, this is where I think his good intentions, that as he understands them with egalitarianism, the problem there is, and this also speaks, by the way, to the role of historicism, because, you know, I've spoken a little bit about the idealism of Plato, but the historicism that he's really especially concerned with from Hegel, it's where positivism and German idealism in the form of Hegel, etc., there are others, collide, because the claim ends up being made that you can make history itself not simply scientific, but philosophically scientific, and so that there are these laws to history. And the one that comes out on top, at least very popularly, is Marx. And that's something that, again, Popper is going to say you can't falsify it. It's in other words, it's a closed system of thought. And so it makes complete sense that it would be a kind of closed society. It would lead to a closed society. But what we need to understand about historicism is that what historicism does is it adds a telos, some kind of defining moment to history. Now we're in the realm of history with a capital H, and it's with a capital H because it has some kind of supervening causal mechanism that is in fact leading it somewhere, whether or not man himself, by his own volition, his own choice, is going to take it there. Now, it could be something that is an ultimate final end, whether it would be the the perfectly communist society with Marxism, or there are people who would offer cycles of history, right? Rise and decline. And there are going to be these various alternating moments. But the key is that there are these key moments. And it's that element of teleology, purposiveness, that is ultimately the problem, and going to, again, sort of define the open society that Popper wants, but in a way that's going to turn out extremely just as bad, and precisely because of the egalitarianism that he's wanting.
Well,
so what happens is
before
that
we chase the consequences of it for a second, I want to really get this. The open society is defined in Popper almost in a negative, right? It's the absence of the grand meta narrative of history,
yes,
rather than the positive existence of it. So Popper would say what unites these regimes that he is so personally interested in delegitimizing is their commitment to a positive teleology that justifies that gives them a kind of collective purpose in history. And he makes the argument that there are different kinds of collective purposes in history, and that all of those represent closed systems and closed societies of various forms, whether that's the closed society of ancient Israel, who believes that they're the chosen people of God and they're a closed society because they've got that meta narrative, or whether that's the Soviet Union that has its own meta narrative. But in any view, from Popper's point of view, that assertion of values is what he wants to hold up, in contrast to the open society, which does not assert values on its own behalf. And
exactly.
It took me quite a while to kind of get this in the text, because he creates this in negative. He doesn't create this in positive, right? He says these are all the bad historicisms. These are all the bad, I forget what the other term he uses is. But these are all the bad people in history who have asserted values. We're going to not do that. Which is very, with coming at this not as a philosopher, but as someone with a basic understanding of anthropology. It's very hard for me to inhabit the mindset where you wouldn't foresee the cataclysm that's going to come from not providing people a meta narrative in which to nest their life. How does Popper think that this is going to work?
I honestly believe that Popper was just an optimist. And I mean, it's kind of ironic saying that about Popper, because he was sort of notoriously kind of a grouch. But I think that he honestly believed that if you could just simply have this permissive egalitarianism without, well, let me phrase it this way. The way that it came to be, at least in America, that has sort of undone us completely, is in the claim, you can do whatever you want, be whatever you want, just don't judge anybody else, right? And so the reason that that's going to involve, Popper having to be this kind of wrecking ball for all these, as you say, these various teleologies or meta narratives of various regimes, is that if you don't replace what you've torn, if you don't have something to put in place of what you've torn down, then you're going to have a radically sort of what we could think of as an atomistic society, in which people, because there's no criteria to say, well, what is the good life? In other words, what is the value of life? They say, well, I'll just pursue whatever end I think fit. And the mass majority of mankind has always been, and probably will always be, when you leave them to their own devices, as far as morality is concerned, they're going to end up choosing what is essentially just the most pleasurable. And so what the end becomes, what the telos becomes, in fact, even if you haven't posited it, like in America, we just say the pursuit of happiness. We don't say what happiness is. That's common in the West with the French Revolution and everything. They always say life, liberty, and some form of happiness, but it's an empty concept because they want you to have that private sphere in which you can sort of pursue it to a certain extent.
The
So,
idea is that the individual puts forward their telos instead of the collective putting forward their telos.
exactly, and I just think that Popper didn't recognize that not making perfectly clear what the good life should be, precisely because he thought that the good life, if you just allowed everyone this kind of, like I said, permissive egalitarianism, then things would be just fine. I think that's sort of the great flaw in his project.
Okay, so
Yeah,
there's
go
a
ahead.
couple of things that you said here that I just want to make sure the audience gets. First of all, the argument here is that Popper and probably his contemporaries, I'm sure as well, provide a philosophical justification for liberalism as a liberalism in terms of values in the society, right?
And
That is
that
to
ends up
say,
being the premise. That's the premise, right? Because remember, he already wants it to be egalitarianism. So he's made that choice. And so in wrecking everything down, that's going to still be what's there
so
in one form or another. Yeah.
when you see liberalism as a value system philosophically, as a sort of philosophical underpinning, America is an example, but many societies have taken this on board in the years following Popper. Popper is a key kind of intellectual justifier of this project.
Yep.
And not only a key intellectual justifier, in his role as a key intellectual justifier, he provides a kind of philosophical framework to those pursuing this project for how to operate this project. So,
And it's the falsification that's the key there, because if someone makes a claim to a truth or knowledge, and you say, and all you can really say about it, because I mean we're not all experts or anything, all you can say is, well, can that even be demonstrated as false? I mean, you're saying it's true, but I mean, I'm sort of looking at it, I'm not really sure. And in fact, I'm not even sure if it can be proven that it's false, right? It's sort of that joke when you say that someone is so wrong they're not even false or something like that. And so that as a kind of tool or criteria is extremely powerful. I mean, that's a good thing, I think, that he brings to the table. So that's why he is so influential and popular on this.
well, I mean, it's a politically powerful thing.
Yeah.
So we've now kind of laid out Popper's basic idea, his opposition to these grand meta narratives, the influence he has on our society. I think it's now time to transition and talk about some of the consequences of the implementation of the open society. And the most obvious consequence is that without grand uniting meta narratives, you have this long period during which Western societies coast on the meta narratives of their ancestors, right? So even if the elite in Canada in 1965 believed in the open society and that grand meta narratives were not the philosophical justification for a society, or not an appropriate philosophical justification for a society, the overwhelming majority of the population still believes in the old grand meta narratives, the ones from the before times, whether that's the project of the British Empire, which was a big deal here, or whether that's the sort of Christian meta narrative to life, which is, I mean, it's a bit complicated and debatable exactly what that is, but that's a whole other discussion. You have these residual meta narratives from periods where Canada was ruled by a regime which Popper would criticize. But they continue to bear the freight of people's need for meaning for many years after the elite kind of move out of this. But as the values of the Canadian elite trickle down, as people like Michael Ignatieff go from positions where they're kind of an extreme minority to positions where they have educated the entire elite class of the society, and their ideas have trickled down through to the rank and file of the society, you discover that without a meta narrative for their life, people will not choose to sacrifice. Right? You described the pursuit of happiness.
At the very least, I mean that's I mean we're talking that's just some entry level stuff, because it gets so much worse even from there.
Well, you discussed the kind of immediate consequences that people who imbibe this philosophy begin to treat as the highest good their own pleasure, right? And if you believe that the highest good is your own pleasure, then you won't. Then sacrifice is anathema. It's philosophically backward.
And look what happens when that any particular pleasure becomes fashionable at the level of politics. So, for instance, I mean, entry level stuff, homosexuality, going up the ladder, transgenderism, continuing up the ladder, literally slobbering over other cultures that don't even want your culture. They're going to use your culture against you. They're going to use your openness against you by coming into your society and saying, well, I don't have to change because you were built on this principle of saying that, you know, you're so open and free. So I'm just as good as you, right? That's the egalitarianism. So there's nothing wrong with mine. And this ends up
I think that
being...
gets to the heart of Mr. Ignatieff's open society and its new enemies, right? Because after these ideas trickle down through and permeate Canadian society, other Western societies, these societies, because they can't justify themselves, to decide to invite everybody else in.
Right.
And it turns out all of those people don't believe in the liberal open society. They have grand meta narratives that justify either their project in your country or their lives in general, that are positivist in nature. And so when Ignatieff and people like him are discussing the new enemies of the open society, I think they're discussing all of the imported meta narratives from elsewhere, rather than when Popper was originally writing, he's discussing meta narratives that are kind of native to the Western tradition.
Yeah, I just, you know, the thing about it is, this is what happens when you start involving philosophy at the level of politics, because let's never forget, most people don't live their lives based on rigorous philosophical proof or anything like that. And that's a good thing too, because I mean, it's like, you know, why should you have to carry around your arguments for why, you know, your life is the best in your back pocket? If anything, that would seem like an indication that, you know, you're sort of lacking confidence in your instincts or something like that. But the thing you'll often always hear is people will say things like, you know, look, it can't get any worse. And I think that coming out of World War II, many people in the Western world just thought to themselves, wow, okay, we made it. That was absolutely the worst it could ever possibly get. But people don't really know how bad it can really get. They almost have no conception of how bad things can really get, especially as at our situation in history in the West, where we're so used to comfortabilities of life. Going to third world countries and you see, oh my God, they're using machetes to hack up little children of their political opponents or something like that, and then they might even eat them or something. So people have no concept of how bad things can get. And I think that Popper, for all of his intentions of, you know, thinking that he could that it wouldn't get worse or something could only get better, he didn't. I don't think he foresaw that element of the kind of depravity in the heart of man. Just because it's in the Western world, or we call it civilized, it doesn't mean that there's not barbarism. You scratch just the surface of it, you've kind of got the barbarism. This is like Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It's sort of what he's showing us, is that Kurtz is all of Western Europe in the Congo, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, there's really three things that I want to call out that I think you can really cleanly lay at the feet of the open society as a philosophical project. The first we've talked about is mass immigration, right? So if you can't assert positive values, a positive meta narrative about your own people and their future and why their future is good and a project that should be pursued, then there's no reason that your people should be preferred over other people, right? In fact, it is a sin against Popper's philosophy to prefer your own over the foreigner. And
let's
so,
be clear about what that means. That means that you can't call something great. So the very status of greatness is already you can't go into it with it, right? You can't speak of a great man or a great people or something like that.
yeah, or a great tradition,
Exactly.
or an inheritance that belongs specifically to us, right?
Exactly.
And so that's one project of the modern world. I mean, I'm not huge on the idea that politicians are prisoners of their philosophy, but if you want to look for the philosophical grounding of the project of mass migration, you can find it in Popper. The second thing that I want to lay at the feet of this, one of the things that I've written a bit about, I've thought a great deal about, is the way that ideas that are manageable for people who are among the elite trickle down and are disastrous for the people who follow them and adopt them at a kind of lower level. And Popper's idea of the open society, if you take it seriously, I think is in substantial part responsible for the fertility crisis. Because the fundamental thing that you do when you have children and raise them is you make sacrifices to your own comfort and pleasure in order to advance the future. And in order for people to justify doing that, they have to believe that they're part of some grand meta narrative. They're part of some story, that the future matters more than their present comfort. Because if you try to justify having children on the basis of the joy that they bring you, which is kind of the way that children were justified in the post-war period, that's a disaster, right? That comes apart really, really quickly on contact with reality, especially when you position it in terms of risks, because your child might be, they might be a Down syndrome child or something, in which case I mean, you're going to have some people who are going to enjoy being with children so much that they have children, that they can justify it on this basis. But the evidence, the kind of empirical evidence, is that the overwhelming number of people are not going to make that choice on the basis of their own pleasure. And I think if you're looking for a philosophical grounding for the fertility crisis, it's the lack of grand meta narrative that Popper's an intellectual opponent of it. Maybe there's some others, but that's kind of the philosophical basis for it.
Yeah, and think of it this way. It's really all encompassed within what we would otherwise call these dating apps, right? The pervasiveness of things like the dating apps makes it such that one can pursue one's pleasure of a kind of bachelorhood. You can have forever bachelors, right? I mean, they've got them for every age group. And
it's like applied Popper as
that's the permissiveness, right? The
Yeah.
permissiveness that he's wanting to say, because and it's permissive precisely because you have no criteria, no, as you're suggesting, these narratives, these of people, to say what is right and what is wrong, right? And so if you make it available to your people that they can just be, forever bachelors, well, they're probably going to do that. I mean, that's just an obvious fact to me. So
Yeah, I mean, if applied Popper in the kitchen is having the option of doing Indian food, Chinese food, Caribbean food, and American food, and British food, then applied Popper in the sphere of personal relationships is to have an infinite menu of potential pleasures.
Yep.
And to make your choice based on your preference for that day. And there are going to be some people who prefer long-term relationships, I guess. But revealed preference is that most people have a kind of biological drive that's going to take them somewhere else. And so without handcuffing them by a duty to a grand meta narrative, they go and do things that are incredibly destructive. And the third piece that I want to lay at the feet of Popper philosophically is the collapse of commitment to what I would call the Western canon very, very broadly. And so if you are philosophically committed to the open society, that means you can't assert the value of one particular body of literature or music or art, or one particular body of political history, or one particular body even of scientific knowledge over another. And so when you go to the Royal Ontario Museum today and you see like a giant wing dedicated to Native American history, this is an expression of the philosophical view that it is inappropriate to privilege the Western tradition and its artifacts, its history, its contribution over the Native American tradition. I mean, the last time I went to the ROM, the section on Chinese history was larger than the section on British history. Because, from a philosophical point of view, why let's put it this way, the Chinese Canadian community wants to privilege their history over others' history, and those descended from the British North American settlers of this country are prisoners of Popper and don't want to assert the value of their own. And you can see this, museums are nice because you can kind of empirically show footprint dedicated to X, Y, and Z. Yeah. But if you went into education and said, well, why is it that John Dewey can say that the goal of education is to allow the child to express themselves rather than what his, stodgy old compatriot probably would have said, which is the duty of education is to teach children to their place inside this grand tradition going back 5,000 years. The roots of this are in this philosophy of openness. And I think we can see the results of this in the artistic and intellectual poverty of our time. We have the largest university apparatus, the most free time to dedicate to art and literature and science, etc., that have ever existed in human history. And yet productivity in art, productivity in architecture, productivity in music, productivity in great literature are at all-time lows.
Yeah. I mean, it's just amazing when you think about it because, people pat themselves on the back thinking that, we've shaken off the yoke of all of these old beliefs of all of these older people. They were only our predecessors. They only gave us the world that we have, but we've outgrown all their superstitions, right? I mean, they were good people or whatever, but we've outgrown their stuff. And people pat themselves on the back about it, and they don't realize that they're just simply embracing. I mean, they're literally in a kind of celebratory way, they're embracing a suicide. I mean, a suicide of them as a people, and many of them are happy about it. I mean, it's just the most amazing thing, example of kind of mind capture that one could ever witness in the history of man, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to say that if you're Michael Ignatieff and you're very intelligent, you've got lots of resources to fall back on, maybe you can afford this as a kind of luxury belief, and the consequences for your life will be lack of self-realization through great art that you miss out on. And that is a serious consequence. I don't want to diminish it. I think this way of thinking has been a disaster for the Canadian elite class and for the elite classes of many liberal countries. But when you take that set of ideas, which are difficult, which pose do a certain amount of damage to the elite class, and you transpose them down the socioeconomic ladder, the consequences to the people who follow are self-extinguishing, right? So for Michael Ignatieff, he misses out on the opportunity to fully enjoy the Western tradition of art, music, etc., because he doesn't know how to orient his values. For his fourth cousin, who's at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, he can't justify why his inheritance should be passed to his descendants and why he should even have descendants at all. And so he ends up handing over his country to foreigners and not having any children and dying in a care home or something.
Yeah. I think that all really nails it. That sort of gets back to your tweet about the role of even having a family, right? Of having children is so important because it forces one to have skin in the game. Now, how much that force is effective in many people's lives. Well, with the elite, usually it's not. I mean, look at most of their kids. Their kids end up being the people that they're championing the causes of, like the homosexuals and transgenders, et cetera. But for regular people, right, that it has trickled down to, they don't have the luxury or the sort of the financial means of just overlooking it and saying, well, my son chose this, and so it's okay for him, right? It's his lifestyle. It doesn't work out that way for those for whom they don't have the luxury of just thinking, well, so it's my kid. No, they have to think much more seriously in all the decisions that they make, because they know how much that's going to cost them by way of their children and the lives of their children and such that they're going to have to witness and everything.
Yeah, for those who don't know what Athenian's referring to, I entered this week into a great flame war on Twitter over the claim that I made that the leaders of the right should be patriarchs. They should be men who have led their family well, who have led men in other capacities, and who have a demonstrated investment in the future by the existence of their children. And there's layers to why I think this, but Athenians laid out part of it. Another big part of this is as we enter into a period where we talked about the academy and the condition of not being able to assert values. We're now moving from an academy that was in that position to an academy which, having been in that condition for a long period of time, is in the process of being eaten by people who can positively assert values, and people who don't have your interests particularly in mind. So instead of being a value neutral institution like it was in its state of decay, it's becoming a value positive institution captured by people who can assert particular values, but those values aren't your values. In a circumstance.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and they are, let's be perfectly clear, they are asserting those values precisely because they do want their children and their descendants to carry that legacy on.
Absolutely. And in that circumstance where you've gone from an institution which was value neutral to an institution which values your destruction, the ability to trust institutions or to trust them even in a kind of disinterested way is in rapid decline, which means that the people that you should look to for leadership are people with skin in the same game as you, right? So instead of looking at people who make particular intellectual claims that you find impressive, my contention is that you should instead look to people for leadership who will suffer consequences of the same actions that you will suffer consequences from. So even if somebody seems very smart, the fact that they won't participate in the consequences of the actions they're encouraging you to participate in disqualifies them as a leader. So if you go back to the article that I relatively recently wrote, where I criticized many of the leaders of the right over the past, 30 or 40 years, one of the men I highlighted was Jordan Peterson in the Canadian context, particularly in the context of the anti-lockdown protests in Canada in 2021, 2022. And the basic reason why I think it was a very foolish thing to do for Canadians to look to him as a leader of that movement is that he was never going to participate in the consequences of whatever decisions he made on behalf of that movement. And I think in an environment like this, people who aren't going to participate in the consequences of the actions they represent are not valid leaders. And I think that's going to be the case for quite a while.
Yeah, one of the things I'm always the first person to say is I spent so much of my life appreciating like the most educated of people, right? And then you just watch as the world started to fall apart, and those allegedly most educated people just went right along with it, and you just have to ask yourself, if that's where the contemporary education and everything has led people, then let's not look at all to those kinds of people, right? The so-called experts. Let's look at people who are living the lives that we want to see going forward, and so it's not so much a thing that the failure of credentialism, right? These so-called great deep thinkers of politics and things, political philosophy, etc. Let's re-examine that. Re-examine the fact that we've followed in so many of their footsteps for so long. How about we start looking towards people who are just living lives that we like to see, and we would like to be in their kind of communities? How about that kind of society? Something like that.
Yeah, and this is like the beginning of a corrective. As I say, I'm not a political philosopher, so I'm not going to overstep on it. But at the least, how do we begin to assure that the people who want to pursue something besides the road that we've been on don't get themselves trampled? And I think the first thing on that list is to make sure that the leaders that they choose for themselves are leaders who are going to participate in the consequences of the actions they collectively take. Athenian, we're running out on time. Is there anything you want to say in conclusion about Popper, or about any of the other subjects we've talked about?
No, this was great. I really enjoyed it. I do hope that listeners take they take away from this and go take a look into these ideas of historicism, idealism that Popper was fighting against, with his unique weapon of a kind of positivism, because those three isms, they haven't really gone anywhere. They're still around. Certainly their legacies are, and it's helpful to at least have a kind of familiarity with them. I mean, I'm not telling people to go plan on devoting years of study to these things, but you need to be, it's helpful to be able to recognize them when you see them in someone talking. It's like, well, wait a minute, that sounds a little too similar to something that I am familiar with that hasn't worked out very well. So hopefully, there's that kind of a takeaway or something.
And again, for those who are interested in your work, you've got your website, Athens Corner. You've got your Twitter account that I'll link in the show notes here. Athenian Stranger is a great resource to kind of get what I would say are about junior college level introductions to the classics, and a great way. I mean, I know I certainly did not participate in a sort of great books classical education. And if you want to kind of catch up on that as an adult, or you want to pass that down to your children, he is a great resource to kind of begin that journey. So I would recommend you go over and have a look if you're interested in any of that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That's sort of what I try to do, is the ground level of people who haven't had any introduction to it and they just want to, they want to start. I try to do that. So.
Well, and I think in terms of things that can be helpful to people, there's a pretty limited pool of the number of people who are going to learn ancient Greek and read these things in their original language and appreciate them in their original context. But the pool of people who would benefit from having an artistic appreciation for the great works of our culture is much broader. Yeah. And I am a huge fan of bringing that to a wider audience. So I'm glad that you're out there doing that. This has been the podcast of the Red Ensign. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and hopefully you have learned something.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.